So as Alan rightly mentions, I'm now a postdoctoral researcher here at KBR and at ULB on the project Camille, which is a research center on and digital archives dedicated to the history of journalism in Belgium. Camille aims at making Belgian historical newspapers digitally available and to stimulate research into them. This is a project that runs over 8 years, and I will invite you to visit the website, which you see up here. I'm looking for the tool. Thank you. So the thing I'll actually be talking about is this, my former job. Until the beginning of this year, I was a postdoctoral researcher at King's College London on the project Radical Translations, the transfer of revolutionary culture between Britain, France and Italy in the revolutionary period, which is sponsored by the Art and Humanities Research Council in the UK. I joined the project in 2019, and I want to stress that I'm a traditional historian with a background in political history, no background at all in data or IT, and that was true for everyone on the team. So we were actually, all of us, newbies to all of this, and I'm afraid that the project might look primitive compared to the great projects we've already heard about before today, but I'll present it anyway, and all your comments are welcome. So none of us had previous experiences with databases, and so the project has been a learning curve for all of us. We've learned to think differently about our qualitative source materials and look at them as data instead, which was new, which was a big step mentally for most of us. And I still see us staring at the flip screens that were proposed by the digital people and not having included what it was about until we started to understand and think like they did, which was an interesting experience, and it turns out that these people were really genius. The database was developed by King's Digital Labs, which has a rich spin-off of King's College London, and they have a rich experience with building databases for humanities projects at King's College London and outside of it. And many of these databases are much larger, in fact, than the Radical Translations database. The challenge for our database was not to include big data, but to make the data as granular as possible. In other words, to describe each record as richly as we could. Another challenge for us was to make our database compatible with other datasets outside of the project, because, as we all know, too many research projects result in databases that become quickly obsolete because they rely on classifications and terms that are proper only to themselves and that cannot really be reused elsewhere. So for our project, we've tried from the outset to enrich our database with data from other sources and also to make our data exportable to other datasets. We have had special interest in exchange with library catalogs, like the one of the British Library, with which we have closely collaborated on this project. And therefore, we've also used as much as possible standardized vocabularies and classifications and have included as many links as possible with other open data sets. So this has resulted in a database with the following architecture. The database was built in Django, which is a Python-based web framework. Obviously, I'll not be able to explain it all in this session, but I'll just try to explain the structure as much as possible. I will do so by reviewing the goals of the project and the different kinds of data it involves, and to discuss the database solutions that we have chosen. And I'll conclude with a few words on the advantages of linked data for me as a traditional historian. Now, Radical Translations, content-wise, is a research project at the intersection of history and translation studies. At the core is a well-known historiographical fact, namely that the French Revolution has been a fundamentally transnational event. The revolution has quickly crossed borders and has encompassed the whole of Europe and beyond in its dynamic. And radical ideas and writings have circulated between different geographical and cultural zones. But how exactly this exchange worked in practice has hardly ever been investigated. So the Radical Translation Project posits that the transnational dynamics of revolution cannot be understood without looking at translation as a phenomenon. As ideas traveled between linguistic zones, they were transformative, or they were transformed in translation, but translation is never a neutral operation. Ideas and text are always adapted to the target language and culture in order to make them digestible. So how did translation enable democratic movements to reach wider publics and to cast themselves as part of an international struggle? And how was a transnational revolutionary idiom adopted, resisted, or rejected in the effort to create locally and culturally specific tools for political action on the ground? These are the two basic questions that guided our project. Now, our investigation centered on two main axes of transmission, one connecting Britain and France, another connecting France and Italy. The rationale behind these choices was that Britain was a society that was arguably least affected by the French Revolution, and on the other side, Italy was probably the most affected by it. So the British political model has been a great source of inspiration for French revolutionaries, whereas Italian Jacobins were very receptive of French revolutionary ideas. So we see two very different dynamics of the export of revolutionary ideas from France to neighboring countries. Now, this choice then enabled us, or the hope was that it would enable us to test existing models about the transnational diffusion of radical ideas across Europe. The challenge then was first to identify a corpus of translated texts. No such list existed, obviously. This is something new that we had to compile ourselves. Lists of translations between those three languages, French, English, and Italian, had been available before, but they never focused just on revolutionary or radical writing. So what constitutes a radical translation depended also on our own interpretation. We have settled a number of criteria, including egalitarianism, anti-clericalism, republicanism, etc., which have then always depended also on the local context. So it's not always an easily objectifiable procedure. Radical political pamphlets by revolutionaries such as Thomas Paine or the Count of Mirabeau are very clear and easy cases, but other cases are more subtle. For example, Gothic novels that often carried a radical subtext or a critique of the old regime absolutism, and they have been included because there is this radical subtext which is not always easily recognizable. A second complication is that we have looked at translation in its broadest sense. We've not only included books and pamphlets, the obvious candidates, but also newspaper articles, journal articles, less fragments of text that were published in other texts, etc. So some of these translations are literal and straightforward, but others are more complicated. They are partial translations, they're extended, they're abridged, they're unpublished even sometimes, or they're fake translations, etc. To capture this rich aspect of radicalizing translations, our data model incorporates a particularly rich typology of translations going much further than the book or reception histories that have usually featured in most studies of the revolutionary period. So each translation record is accordingly given one or several of the following descriptions adapted from the Library of Congress classification system. It's abridged, adapted, extended, compiled, simplified, integral, partial, etc., etc., as you can see on the screen. Then subjects and genres of each translation have been described using controlled vocabulary derived from the FAST classification. FAST is faceted application of subject terminology, which is also derived from Library of Congress subject headings and is one of the library domains most widely used for subject terminology schemas. So as you can see on this slide, which features some of the many filters that our records hold. Then to organize these texts in our database, we have followed the BibFrame model for cataloging, which enables records to be filtered by genre, theme, translator, publisher, date of publication, etc. We've already heard this morning about the BibFrame model in a very interesting presentation. The model has the advantage that it allows for a very granular description of the resources. It distinguishes between three instances of a work: the work on a conceptual level, the instance of a work, and the level of the item of a work, which is the material copy of a work. So three levels which are interesting for us to look at our material. And when available, a link has been included to a digitized version of the text so that the user can directly access it. So here we see one very famous text where there's a URL attached, so they can link to the digitized version on Google usually. Now, in our project, it was very important to look at precise editions of works and moreover to map paratexts. Paratexts are a big thing in translation studies these days. They are the material that surrounds the text, and it is here that the translator's voice can be heard and that evidence can be gleaned as to why and how a particular text was translated at a particular time. Very often it's a preface or a conclusion, but it can also be a footnote or just a motto or even a visual element that is part of the particular edition. So we've decided, because of the importance of the paratext, to create separate records for them, for the paratextual metadata in our corpus in order to enable qualitative as well as quantitative analysis. Again, controlled vocabularies have been used to classify paratexts, both according to their form, so a preface, note, dedication, etc., and their genre, as well as other features. So here, again, you see a list of filters for the paratexts. So this has resulted in three kinds of resources: source text, translations, and paratexts, which can be filtered as such, and structured relationships have been established between the resources to map which text is a paratext or a translation of which other text. Apart from these structured filters, each record also has a note section where qualitative information is provided that motivated the text inclusion in the database, sometimes in the form of extracts. So that's where our more qualitative research comes in. To take an example, here we see the record for the abolitionist novel Paul et Virginie by Bernardin Saint-Pierre from 1788, which was a huge hit in French, but also in other languages, has been translated. It's probably the most translated novel of the 18th century. And here we see an overview of the old translations in Italian and in English. If we then click on the 1795 translation by the English activist translator Helen Maria Williams, we see this record. And if we then click on the paratexts, which in this case is a preface added to the translation by Williams, we get this record. Now, it was essential to our project that we did not only look at text, however. The people who wrote them, the translators, were at least as important. We needed those translators to provide us with the cultural and political background in which these translations had been made, which is often essential to try to assess their radicality. For this reason, we built a second data set, namely a prosopography of radical translators, so people data set. So we've included translators, but also authors of original works and publishers in this data set, resulting in a category of agents. And except in the case for anonymous works, we identified these agents and completed a biographical record on them. For the professional roles assigned to agents, we have relied on the terminology provided by Wikidata. This is the beginning of our alphabetical list of agents. And here we see the record for Helen Maria Williams, one of the central figures in our prosopography, with the list of translations to her name. We've also identified connections between agents to see if they moved in the same networks, if they met each other, if they knew each other. And therefore, we've identified organizations that our agents were part of and where they may have met each other. In this case, for example, we see the network of the radical translator François-Xavier Lantenat, and then the list of the people he knew and the list of organizations he was a member of. These data have then been integrated in a visualization function with various functions that you can see here. This part is not as yet accessible on a database, but I think this is under construction. Here you can see the whole network of all the agents that we have. If you then click, obviously all the dots are clickable and will lead to records. If you then click on the record of Thomas Paine, who is one of the most important protagonists in the revolutionary period and also in our database, we get this, so we see whom he was well connected with. And if we click on his record here, we see links to authority databases, especially VIAF and Wikidata, and also the thesaurus of the CERL, which is a consortium of European research libraries for publishers and printers. So we've tried as much as possible to connect to these external authority lists. Two last data sets that were important for us were events and places, because the revolutionary period is dynamic and changeable, And to understand the impact of translation, we needed to be closely informed of the political context in a particular place at a particular time. And we wanted to track and visualize the movements of people and of text across time and space. Therefore, we've established chronologies for the different geographical zones of investigation. And we have included dates and geonames for all the people and resources. And this then has resulted in visualizations like this one, where we can map the occurrence of source texts and translations on a time scale and a temporal scale, including the particular events of each geographical zone. To quickly conclude, the database about the advantages of Openlink data for the research. The radical translation database is comparatively small. The workflow looks like this. It's very rich, though. We've chosen to provide a lot of information about the corpus that in itself is not very large compared to other bibliographical projects. And we've identified 5 different sets of data: resources, agents, events, places, and dates. The database is relational in that connections can be established between all these different kind of dates. From my perspective as a traditional historian, a lot is to be gained from this linked open data approach because structural analysis of qualitative data is possible, and this data can be connected to other data sets. As I've already mentioned, our work on a database can be fed into other data sets, and data can be exported also as CVS files to feed into other sets. Our own data have been enriched by VIAF, by Wikidata, and by other repositories. And from a user perspective, I think a very rich source of information is present. Users can simply click through to detailed information about people and places outside of the database. And the texts themselves are often accessible in a digitized format, again, thanks to external links. And thanks to these features, the database is part of a larger network of information. If an internet user Googled Thomas Paine, for example, he will usually quickly find a link to the radical translations record high up in his query. And I think the approach we followed with Openlink data has made the data findable and visible and connected, which is a great thing. I'm going to end with a little publicity. Because on 4 and 5 November, the Radical Translations team is organizing its final workshop. The project is coming to a close at King's College London, entitled Entangled Histories of Revolution, I should say. The goal is to bring together historians, literary scholars, and translation historians to share their respective approaches to studying the revolutionary past. More information can be found on the project website, and I thank you for your attention.